Now that you've watched The Lodger and have done some reading, writing, and discussing, just a few things to think about relative to the production of the film, as well as some things to continue to think about the film itself. Just a bit of the backstory that relates to the production of the film. Now, prior to The Lodger, Hitchcock had worked as an assistant director with this star director named Graham Cutts. They worked together specifically on this 1924 film called The White Shadow. But Graham Cutts essentially got fired from as a star director for not doing his job. And Hitchcock was then promoted from being assistant director to director. And rather awkwardly, then Graham Cutt had to work for Hitchcock on The Lodger. So the power status was kind of flip flopped there. Hitchcock felt quite awkward working for this former star director and kind of giving him the orders. But for Graham Cutts, the animosity went much deeper than just feeling awkward. He was really resentful of the ease with which Hitchcock worked and with the cooperation that he got from his crew. And he was really jealous of Hitchcock's sort of swift rise in the industry. Graham Cutts began to tell anybody who would listen that we had a disaster on our hands with regards to the lodger. So he was trying to undercut the lodger itself and undercut Hitchcock. And Cutts, because he had been the star director, he really retained a large degree of professional influence at the studio. And and he said he had told the studio heads that this film, The Lodger, was incomprehensible. And he was able to convince the head of distribution, C.M. Wolfe, that it was an unreleasable film. And without even having seen the film itself, C.M. Wolfe told Hitchcock, quote, "Your picture is so dreadful that we're just going to have to put it on the shelf and forget about it." So Wolf, because he was then the head of distribution, he held up the release not only of The Lodger, but of Hitchcock's films that he had already done, including The Pleasure Garden and The Mountain Eagle. And Hitchcock's career might have ended at that point because of Graham Cutts' resentfulness and because of his influence with the studio. However, there was another studio, Victory Films, and the co-founder was Michael Balcon, and he kind of came to Hitchcock's rescue. He had some faith in The Lodger, and he contacted this founding member of the London Film Society, a guy named Ivor Montague. And Montague worked at the Film Society translating titles and reading foreign films, and he had quite a bit of respect. He was sort of the London Film Society's token intellectual. He traveled to Germany in 1925 to cover the growth of the film industry there, and he became immersed in the German expressionist style. So he was kind of an expert in England. So Balcon, who had seen Hitchcock's film The Lodger, he was praising it to high heaven, and he essentially convinced Montague to see The Lodger. And when Montague saw this film, he was really, really impressed, and he was interested in trying to get Hitchcock's film promoted. Now, Montague did suggest paring down the number of title cards that Hitchcock had included, and he suggested reshooting a few scenes that he thought were unclear. And he also suggested adding the triangle art motif that we see in the film behind some of those title cards to kind of help mirror the love triangle of the story. So then they essentially met with Hitchcock, Balcon and Montague, and they convinced him really to make these changes. Hitchcock was quite reluctant at first to do this, but he did later admit that those changes improved the film. So, with the support of Balcon and Montague, the film was finally released, and it was an immediate hit with audiences. It was immediately popular with audiences, and even critics really loved it as well. One newspaper said of the film, "It is possible that this film is the finest British production ever made." Now, one interesting point, Hitchcock never publicly mentioned or credited Montague with helping him or suggesting he made the specific changes. You read, for example, in that Truffaut section about The Lodger, where Hitchcock described the situation, and this is how he described it. Hitchcock said, "A few months later, they decided to take another look at the picture and to make some changes. I agreed to make about two." So this is rather a gross reduction of the number of changes. And his description really glosses over those who helped him. So that tells you a little bit about Hitchcock's personality himself. He really didn't like the idea of anybody putting in their oar, so to speak, and changing the film, even though he did feel that those changes that were made were valuable. In any case, the success of The Lodger led to this multi-picture deal for Hitchcock at British International Pictures, and this was would have been a different studio, and it became the studio that produced the film Blackmail, which we're going to be watching next after The Lodger. A few points about The Lodger, and as we go over these, let's keep in mind the points of auteur theory that we started out the quarter with, kind of thinking about what are the characteristics of an auteur. And as I'm going over some of the points in The Lodger in just a moment, keep these three kind of characteristics in mind. So what do we observe about Hitchcock's technical skill, his control, and his choices at every level of filmmaking? That's point number one. Characteristic number two, what can we observe about the distinguishable personality of the director? What are maybe some recurring characteristics of style? And I realize, of course, those are hard to see at this point since maybe you haven't seen much of Hitchcock's body of work yet, but it is something that you should keep track of as the quarter goes on. Kind of note what are some of the motifs in The Lodger itself, and then kind of keep those, as it were, in your head as you continue to watch his films. And then the third characteristic of an auteur, and we can think about whether we see that in this film, is there some kind of, quote, interior meaning, that sort of ineffable quality that we can try to see and understand, something that comes only through the medium of cinema itself, through this visual medium, and maybe something that raises this film to the level of art. So keep those three characteristics in mind as I'm going over some of these points that I want us to think about with The Lodger. So one point that I think is possibly really interesting and could possibly expand into an essay if you're interested in continuing thinking about it, is essentially this, that the starting premise of the film is that there is a serial killer, and it sounds very much like Jack the Ripper, and the serial killer is murdering young blonde women. These are ritualized killings. It comes complete with a calling card. And now a classic murder mystery is primarily interested in solving the mystery. It's kind of a whodunit. In a classic murder mystery, we always find out in the end who the murderer is. But that's not really Hitchcock's interest here. We never actually find out who the serial killer, the Avenger, is. We only know that he's been arrested. So we never get his psychology, his backstory. We never know his motives. We might note that a key focus of the film then is not the murders themselves, but it's Hitchcock is much more interested in the reaction of people to the murders. And we might reflect on the groups of people who are doing that reacting, and we might kind of characterize their reactions. What are they characterized by? The opening montage of the film, of course, is dominated not really by the murders themselves, but by the media coverage of the murders. And we get this sort of wonderful montage of how the idea of the murders or the news about the murders is passed on through these various venues. First, the journalist uses their phone, and then then they type it out, and then it's communicated by phone, and then it goes into this machine of the newspaper printing it out, and then we get the newspaper spread around, and then it goes to radio. So it's this kind of amplification of these murders. And then there's also these reactions to the murders by various groups of people in the film that Hitchcock is interested in focusing on. So we get the reaction of these female models, and models. One interesting thing about models is they are kind of these dual objects. They are sort of dual objects of male desire, but also objects of aggression, of course. And we might ask if there's some kind of a connection between what might be their kind of mundane job of being looked at as models and then the murderer's fixation on them. Is there something kind of inherently troubling about their day job as models and the way that people are constantly watching them and watching their bodies and watching them as they model these clothes? So that's one reaction. We get the reaction of the female models, and we are forced to kind of think from their perspective a little bit what it would be like to be them. We also, of course, get the reaction of Daisy's family unit, this kind of nuclear family, to the murders. We get the reaction of what might be kind of, I guess we could call him a bit of a dim-witted policeman, Joe. He seems pretty excited about the prospect of becoming maybe a hero. In relative to capturing the murderer. And then, of course, we get the reaction of these mobs of people to the rumor and the paranoia and the news of the murderers. So I'm going to leave you to think about those things on your own a little bit, those kinds of reactions of various groups that Hitchcock is interested in. And you might reflect on the fact, too, that Hitchcock in his films is never merely interested in murder for murder's sake or crime for crime's sake, but he's always interested in how characters in his films react to crimes and how they're often maybe complicit in some ways in the crimes themselves. For example, the mob in this film, they become so frantic about the murders that they themselves nearly murder an innocent person, right? So they, in a way, are complicit, or at least that you might see that they could themselves do what they are afraid of. And then, of course, we get Joe, the policeman, who is so invested in his own dignity and his jealousy and his love affair that he becomes fixated on the wrong person as the murderer. So, this upstanding guy, this policeman himself, could, in some sense, become complicit in murder if he had gone through with arresting the lodger and having the lodger, say, hanged for the murders of the Avenger. So there's that potential that we see this person who was a good guy become a bad guy in a way. We should also think about the fact that Hitchcock is always thinking about his audience, how we are reacting to things, and how we are potentially, in some ways, complicit in a crime or a murder or whatever it is that he's showing on to us on screen, because of the simple fact that we are thrilled, really, by watching these things play out on screen in front of us, very much like the way at the beginning of this film, people are riveted by the news of these murders. So that's something to continue to think about. The character of the lodger is also really interesting, and I think worth reflecting on. Just his entrance alone is quite interesting. He's not introduced for several minutes, even though the film is reportedly about him. He's in the title. He is introduced really as someone who looks almost exactly like the serial murderer. And the first image of him is of this shadow, his shadow on the door, and there's the number 13. The number 13, by the way, is frequent. Hitchcock loves that number. His birthday was August 16th, and he frequently uses that number in his films. And as a kind of, I think it's a bit fun, but it also can be symbolic. Of course, the number 13 has these sort of dangerous overtones. So we see the shadow of the lodger paired with the number 13 there. And so all of those visuals, of course, are meant for us to associate him with the Avenger, to make us suspicious of him right away. And in this regard, the fact of his namelessness is interesting. We never know the lodger's name. And that is very much like the Avenger. We don't know either man's name, even until the very end. So by the end of the film, there's continues to be a kind of a parallel between the lodger and the avenger, even after that happy ending. Both of these men just have titles, they don't have names. We might consider too the lodger's motivations when we find out what they are. There's potentially a very strong moral ambiguity to his character. Even though we know he's not the avenger, there is the avenger, the person who was doing the murders gets arrested. But you'll remember that from your reading that Hitchcock originally wanted to make the lodger possibly guilty of the murders, to have him kind of go off into the shadows, and we never learn if he is innocent or not. Now, Hitchcock, he didn't get that original ending, his original idea, of course. But the suggestion really that the lodger parallels the Avenger is unmistakable. Again, both men are nameless. They're visually similar. We never know the motives of the Avenger, but we do actually know that the lodger is, in fact, a would be avenger, right? His mission is to avenge the murder of his sister, and his intent is to kill someone. And it certainly seems like a righteous cause. I mean, his sister was murdered, so, he wants to seek out justice. but it is a vendetta kind of a justice. It's not a true sort of justice, it's not an unbiased justice. So we are left considering the moral ambiguity of the lodger, which is quite interesting. Another point to consider briefly, Hitchcock has said that his start in silent pictures forced him to learn to convey narrative information completely visually. And he later remarked that for many movies, the inclusion of dialogue or voiceover to tell a story constituted what he felt was a failure on the filmmaker's part. As movies, a visual medium should rely primarily on visual means. So the Lodger represents Hitchcock's first achievement in this vein and in terms of being able to represent something visually on screen. And in the Truffaut interviews, Hitchcock, of course, says, I took a pure narrative and for the first time presented ideas in purely visual terms. So it's important, an important question to ask is that we can ask where we see the film expressing something purely in visual terms. And that's something we're going to continue to look at throughout the quarter. Now, just a few examples that I noted, and I'm sure you will think of others. But we have this wonderful sequence of the mother listening to the footsteps, and when we just see the lodger going out the door, and then we see her responding. We hear nothing, of course, but the sound, as it were, is in the visuals. We also get that media coverage, of course, and the listening faces, and we get the sense of urgency and panic of the media and of the people listening to the media through that montage. We get these wonderful glass ceiling footsteps, and as well as the use of the chandelier to represent the lodger. So we have that wonderful overlay of the lodger's feet over the chandelier, and then every time we see the chandelier after that, it's associated with the lodger in a kind of wonderfully symbolic way. We also have that really wonderful sequence where Joe is really dejected, his head is in his hands, and he's kind of trying to figure things out. And we sort of see his thinking, as it were, as he stares at the footprint in the ground in front of him. We see images projected within the footprint that represent his thoughts as he puts together his idea that the lodger is the avenger. Really a wonderful sequence there. And then we also get lots of visual representations of golden hair, and it's kind of this constant reminder throughout the film of the dual obsession of the Avenger and of the Lodger himself, who, of course, is obsessed with avenging his blonde sister's murder. And then, so we get him looking at Daisy's hair, we get fingers running through hair, we get images of Daisy taking off. Taking off Daisy's hat. We get all these blonde women portraits. There's this constant visual motif of blonde women throughout the film. Another example of visual storytelling that's really quite wonderful is back to the mother when she's listening to the lodger. There's this image of her in her bedroom and these wonderful shadows cast against the wall, and there's kind of this nightmare feel with those shadows that are skewed, and the mother looks quite small in the frame, and it's kind of this beautiful image of vulnerability made visual. Another one of my favorite sequences is this bath time sequence where there's this wonderful sense of the lodger seems to be quite innocent. He just wants to talk to Daisy, but the way that images are put together, we get a sense of desire and menace and intimacy, as well as innocence and vulnerability, and perhaps even sexual transgression there. So there's a lot that's communicated and a lot that's in the subtext in that visual imagery there. We also get some really interesting visual images of menace. Here's just one example. This instance where Daisy brings in the lodger's dinner tray and sets it on the table, and the lodger picks up the knife, and we get this focus on the knife, and he raises it to her belly, and it's quite, again, another image of menace, and then he flicks off the crumb, and you have Daisy have this kind of coy expression on her face, and then the lodger also with this kind of strange expression on his face as well. So there's kind of this, the sequence conveys the menace of the lodger and also perhaps the sexual danger that he represents. And it's tied to the rising sexual tension between him and Daisy. And it also underscores, of course, our idea that the lodger might be the avenger. He might be an actual threat to Daisy. Another key thing to think about besides the visual storytelling is just the wrong man theme. So the lodger marks the beginning of the traditional Hitchcock canon for being the first of his movies to focus on an innocent man accused of a crime he did not commit. And you might consider, based just on what you've seen in this film so far, why the wrong man theme or trope might be an interesting one to Hitchcock. Now, in the Truffaut interviews, Hitchcock says the theme of the innocent man being accused, I feel, provides the audience with the greatest sense of danger. And that's certainly true, I think, but I think there's also a lot more to consider than that, especially from a thematic perspective. In part because Hitchcock's films often play on a feeling of guilt in everyone, something I think that's quite human. I don't know if you've had it before, but I certainly have. That when I see, if I'm driving and I see a police car, I immediately have that sense of guilt or worry or, oh no, was I speeding? Did I do something wrong? And even that simultaneous worry that even if I wasn't speeding, I'll be accused of doing something wrong. So I think that whole wrong man theme that Hitchcock is playing into really sort of taps into the very human fear that we do perhaps have kind of a guilty sense or aware of the things that we've done wrong, but also we have a fear perhaps of being accused of something we haven't done. This film too taps into a kind of a martyrdom with the wrong man trope. There's some really specifically religious imagery in the film that links to the lodger being sort of a Christ figure. This image here of the stairs, for example, feels very much like kind of a Christ figure being led off, sort of a lamb to the slaughter sort of a thing. Even the lodger's posture there feels very much like a kind of Christ image. The triangle motif is also worth thinking about in this film, and there are a number of ways that we can see it. I've given you a few images there, but in the opening image, there's this triangle that surrounds a dark figure. Of course, the Avengers signature, as we've seen, is a triangle. Whenever we see Daisy's name in the inner title cards, it has a triangle. Soon after we see the police have plotted the location of the Avengers, there's a large triangle on the map. And then there's also a triangle motif, and it's that triangle motif is not just in the visuals, but it's in the relationships too. There is this love triangle between Lodger, the Daisy, and Joe, and we might even think of a sort of triangle between the Lodger, the Avenger, and the Lodger's sister. A little bit darker triangle there, but also nonetheless another kind of a lodger where there is two men and one woman. Then the final scenes of the film were left with some more images of triangles there. We see that square with the triangles in the corners above the lodger's bed instead of a cross. And so I think the idea of a triangle is this kind of figure of complexity, really, rather than something that's straightforward with parallel ideas. The triangle itself evokes an idea of complexity. One final thing, the handcuffs are worth reflecting on as well. And we're going to see handcuffs come back in Hitchcock's work, especially in something like the 39 Steps. So this scene, I think, is really interesting and evocative. So soon after Joe arrives at the home of Daisy, and he announces with pride at one point that he's been put on the Avenger case, and he brandishes this pair of handcuffs. And he says, once I put these bracelets on the Avenger, I will put a ring on Daisy's finger. And soon after this, Joe gets his head start then by putting these handcuffs on Daisy. So Joe is quite perversely associating catching a serial murderer and putting him in handcuffs with catching Daisy and binding her in marriage to himself. Quite a disturbing kind of idea. But there's this suggested idea in the film then that marriage is binding, perhaps especially for women, and there's a kind of a power imbalance there, which is quite interesting. And then there, of course, is this suggestion of sexual perversion as a subtext of the film, that Joe is this policeman and he's supposed to be a good guy, but he seems in some sense to be getting off on this fetishistic attraction to handcuffs. So that adds to the moral ambiguity that is already there with Joe. So there's a lot going on in this film. Keep thinking about it and keep reflecting on it. There are really a lot of complexities and themes and characters and motifs that will come up in later films that we watch too, that we see a lot of in this film, and that I look forward to thinking about and discussing with you.